Okay, well, we've got a nice group at the moment. And so while people stream in, I just want to say welcome everyone to our November Day Lecture, our Royal Australian Historical Society November Day Lecture, to be presented by Anna Johnston. And for anyone who hasn't attended our events before, just a bit of housekeeping. We request that you use the Q&A, but if you have issues with the Q&A, you're more than welcome to use the chat. And when we get to the question segment at the towards the end of the hour, we'll go through those and Anna will be able to answer your questions. So now I'm going to pass over to the RAHS Senior Vice President, Christine Yates, who will introduce our speaker and topic for today.
Thanks, Philip. And I'm so pleased to see everyone there, even if it's in the virtual space. And I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands on which we're all meeting today, both in New South Wales and indeed in Queensland. And I'm on the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. We have posed a question: what if the Australian colonies, far flung and usually consisted peripheral to 19th century Europe, were in fact central to the period's philosophical, ethical and scientific developments? And today's speaker, Dr. Anna Johnston, Professor, I should say, Anna Johnston, will discuss those questions. And I am delighted to be welcoming Anna here today. She is the Professor of English at the University of Queensland. She held an ARC Queensland Queen Elizabeth II and future fellowships at the University of Tasmania and the University of Queensland. And she was the 2022 John Oxley Honorary Research Fellow at the State Library of Queensland. In addition to the book that she'll be discussing today, which is Antipodean Laboratory, Making Colonial Knowledge 1770 to 1870, she has also written other books, and one that particularly caught my attention is Eliza Hamilton Dunlop, Writing from the Colonial Frontier, which was edited with the late Elizabeth Webby. In addition, she's also written The Paper War, Morality, Print Culture and Power in Colonial New South Wales, and Missionary, Writing and Empire. What a great mix. And I think we are very fortunate that Anna has made the time today to speak to us. So please join me in welcoming Anna virtually. Welcome.
Many thanks, Christine, and to the Royal Australian Historical Society for inviting me and for enabling me to share my enthusiasm about my book. I'm speaking to you today from Brisbane, not actually at the University of Queensland today. I'm hiding at home. Meanjin Maganjin is the kind of evolving name for the city of Brisbane. Meanjin you'll recognise from an important cultural magazine of the 20th century. Maganjin seems to be emerging as the new, more correct pronunciation. But we are so fortunate to live by the beautiful Maiwar River and to have the land looked after by the traditional custodians, the Turrbal and Yuggera people, and I acknowledge their contributions to knowledge, to storytelling and to custodianship of place, and acknowledge any Indigenous audience members today. As you'll hear in my paper, the connections between Indigenous knowledge systems and European knowledge systems in the place we now call Australia is central to the kinds of thinking I'm wanting to do in this book. So it's a great pleasure to have and take up this opportunity to talk about my new book. And I'm going to talk to you about the cover first of all. Rebecca Jewell's artwork, Captain Cook's Headdress, features on the cover of this book. This stunning artwork was commissioned by the Royal Maritime Museum at Greenwich as part of their new Pacific Encounters gallery, which opened in 2018, Jewel brought together her training as a natural history curator and natural history illustrator, her research on Pacific cultures with Nicholas Thomas at Cambridge, a year she spent in the Western Highlands living with anthropologists and Papua New Guineans, and her experiences as a milliner, a hat maker, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as I go, to create this beautiful three-dimensional sculpture that is now displayed on the walls at Queen's House Gallery at the Royal Maritime Museum. For this work, Jewel painstakingly prints images from John Hawkesworth's journal account, the account of the voyages undertaken by the order of His present Majesty for making discoveries in the Southern Hemisphere, otherwise known as the Cook Journals, although it contains many other accounts as well. And she takes these images and prints them onto dove, goose, and turkey feathers. You can see printed onto these feathers European and Pacific faces, which have become well known in European art history and travel writing. And they define the circumference of a rich aura of images that fan out from the central lacing of the headdress. Cameo portraits, I'm just trying to give you some close-ups here, of the young Sir Joseph Banks, Captain James Cook, natural history illustrator Sidney Parkinson, the botanists Daniel Solander and Georg Forster are featured. Individual Polynesian men also feature in full-length portraits, such as Joshua Reynolds' 1776 portrait of the Raiatean traveller Mai, and an earlier engraving that you can see here. Pacific artefacts rich in historical and cultural significance are pictured by Rebecca Jewell, including the full-length mourner's costume from the Society Islands that was collected by Banks. So too, Jewell uses Benjamin West's 1772 portrait of Joseph Banks, which you can see here in the top right, wrapped in Maori tapa cloth and surrounded by Pacific objects that he brought back to England. And between the black and white paper lithographed images, Jewell places exquisite watercolour images from Banks's Florilegium, the other major part of his collections from the Southern Hemisphere, with their living greens and yellows. I like to think that the botanical specimens revivify the black and white portraits and the nautical instruments of the time, sextants, sailing ships, and navigational tools that remind us that the endeavour has been aptly termed a floating laboratory, a term I'll come back to later. I met Rebecca Jewell in London following a public lecture I gave about Banks's Florilegium at the Royal Maritime Museum in 2017. And the moment she showed me this work on her phone, I knew it would be on the cover of my book. Like many artists and researchers in the Northern and Southern Hemispheres, we were separately wrestling with ideas about how to acknowledge the beauty, curiosity, and deep Indigenous knowledge embedded in these paradigmatic images and artefacts of the Enlightenment voyages, while also accounting for the violence and dispossession that took them from the Pacific into European hands. In Jewell's new artwork, both colonial and Pacific materials are given equal aesthetic standing in ways that preserves their embedded knowledge and resituates them in ways that try to join the history of colonial collecting with the ontology of Pacific material culture. And extending this work from the Pacific to the Australian colonies, as the Cook's voyage did, is one way to conceptualise the broad remit of my book. So in the Antipodean laboratory, I analysed the ways in which knowledge was collected, produced, and transmitted in colonial locations and in metropolitan European sites. Accounts of convicts, natural history, and humanitarian concerns about Indigenous peoples and cultures streamed out from Southern correspondence across the first 100 years of Australia's settler colonial history, which is my focus in this book. So geographically, the massive island continent may have seemed distant from the European centres that had imagined its presence in classical times as a kind of southern counterweight. But from the exploration voyage onwards, strong tendrils tethered Australian knowledge to Northern Hemisphere interests. Colonial officials, chaplains, governors, travellers, writers and commentators did not go to the colonies to be ignored. Rather, many went to make their name in the innovative settler societies that were open to ambition, new ideas and experimental practices. They wrote constantly to make sure their opinions were heard. And even those who we might have expected to be quiet about settler colonialism, if not silenced by it, say exiled convicts and the Indigenous people displaced and dispossessed by the expansion of territory, discovered quickly that there was an audience for their writing about colonial experiences, and their texts could influence near and far readers to act. Colonial knowledge production made use of European precedents and modern systems of collecting and organising information, but it also shaped global systems from botanical classification to the social sciences and religious and humanitarian aid. As a literary scholar, I'm particularly interested in tracing how paper and print worked as vehicles to shape a modern settler southern sphere that overlapped with Indigenous, Asian, and Pacific worlds to produce new specimens and new epistemologies that required new and adaptive ways of representing knowledge and new ways of reading. The southern continent, of course, had been long imagined as a topsy-turvy counterbalance to the northern hemisphere. In ancient Greek, for example, the Antipodes were imagined as occupied by people whose head and feet were transposed, or who had very large feet because they were clearly walking upside down compared to this northern hemisphere. And when curious Britons imagined and then later visited the Australian colonies, they certainly found many perplexing realities to challenge their experience and expectations. You can see this here in the travel book by Godfrey Charles Mundy, who still imagines in 1852 Australia as the opposite, the place of production, the opposite to the place of writing in the Northern Hemisphere. And things such as flora and fauna similarly perplexed many visitors. The platypus, for example, were widely believed by European natural historians to be fakes, something like carnival mermaids sewn together from various parts of other animals. But soon sufficient data returned from the colonies to prove the existence of this water-dwelling mammal, which bore live young, making Australian marsupials a unique proposition to fit into scientific taxonomies. So as one example of this kind of data and knowledge production, let's think about 1838 in Government House in Hobart, where the colonial-born Dr. Edmund Robson put a drop of platypus blood under the Parisian microscope he had brought to show members at the first meeting of the Tasmanian Philosophical Society, sponsored by the Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Franklin. Hobson published a paper about platypus blood in the first 1841 issue of Australia's first scientific journal, the Tasmanian Journal of Natural Science, Agriculture and Statistics, which was carefully managed by Lady Jane Franklin. John Franklin fondly called this journal our Platypus Journal, and an image of the creature and a teasing Latin tag Here translated, meaning all things are queer and opposite here, was appended by the colonial elites that were part of the Tasmanian Philosophical Society. Like the famed Ornithorhynchus, rumours of the journal were considered a hoax by skeptics such as Justice Sir John Pedder. Jane Franklin used what I term dinner party diplomacy to ensure contributions to the journal by local and visiting naturalists, and she was highly effective. Hobson, however, also sent his platypus findings to his English friend Richard Owen, a highly influential naturalist and paleontologist. Owen used Hobson's evidence to build his expertise in Australian specimens, writing the first monotremata entry for the Cyclopedia of Anatomy and Physiology. This circuit of knowledge, the microscope Hobson carried from Paris to Hobart, the icy southern rivulet from which Hobson or an assistant extracted the platypus, the dining room table at the governor's residence in Hobart, the pages of colonial journals and metropolitan print outlets is just one of the fascinating instances I explore that show how colonial Australian information travelled and whom it influenced. Word lists, observations, measurements, sketches and paintings, letters and private and published diaries and travel accounts turned experiences in the Australian colonies into data. Now, there was an eager audience for this colonial information. Interested British observers actively solicited correspondence that fed the hunger for knowledge. For example, Thomas Fowle Buxton declared in 1838 at a meeting at Exeter Hall in London, the epicentre of the global evangelical movement, that no greater calamity has been inflicted on the Aborigines of Australia and the South Seas than the transportation of our convicts. Linking what he called the gigantic efforts of modern commerce that had driven a tide of emigration to what he called the occupation of new territories of Aboriginal territory, the humanitarian and former Member of Parliament explicitly called for a shift of public support from the abolitionist movement to the broader political campaign that he called to rescue and elevate the coloured races at large. Now, Buxton had chaired the 1835 to 1837 Select Committee on Aborigines in the British settlements and oversaw the publication of the committee's official report. In 1838, Buxton was elected president of the Aborigines Protection Society, which he had co-founded with the Quaker physician and philanthropist, Dr. Thomas Hodgkin. The object of the society was, quote, to assist in protecting the defenceless and promoting the advancement of the uncivilized tribes. Nothing less was at stake for this society than remediating the national escutcheon of Great Britain, which had, Buxton said, been deeply stained during a long course of years by the intercourse Englishmen have had with coloured races. The stain, he said, was a tendency of imperial expansion to scatter misery and devastation over a fair portion of the globe, and the Australian colonies were well in his target. Buxton's committee identified the legal vulnerability of Pacific and Aotearoa New Zealand to what he called a new race of buccaneers because they were outside of imperial legal systems. This was prior to the British annexation of Aotearoa New Zealand. This challenge to the otherwise triumphant imperial narratives of progress and expansion came from a religiously inspired humanitarian elite motivated to gather evidence to question the morality of imperial expansion and its contaminating effects, and they aimed to introduce their own colonial reforms. Now, Buxton imagined that the Aborigines Protection Society was ideally positioned to collect information from colonial locations and turn it into useful knowledge that would change public opinion. and support humanitarian interventions. He sought the collection of authentic information regarding the characters, habits, and wants of uncivilized tribes, and particularly those in or near the British colonies. He called from correspondence from well-informed gentlemen to convey the most specific and authentic intelligence on Indigenous cultures and colonial affairs. The APS planned to use that information both to influence imperial policy and to provide the basis for what they called cheap publications, to excite the interest of all classes and thus to ensure the extension of correct opinions. These corrected opinions, enabled by this authoritative knowledge and conveyed by the burgeoning mass of print culture that exploded in the 19th century, sought to oppose the damage done in colonial locations, especially to Indigenous populations. So the APS and Buxton saw colonial knowledge and print culture as the ways in which the mighty engine of British imperial expansion could be subjected to scrutiny and moral reform. And in many ways, they built on the success of the missionary societies' publishing initiatives to mobilise their networks of correspondence to transform print, literacy and knowledge in the 19th century public sphere. While humanitarian activists did seek concrete improvements in colonial governance, they also undertook a major task of collecting and disseminating information, and in many ways, this was their major legacy. So if I've talked to you before about the Antipodes and the ways in which this location was seen as one of fascination and curiosity and a source of knowledge, I want to go on and talk to you about the other major term in my book title, the idea of the Australian colonies as a laboratory. So what does it mean to call the Australian colonies a laboratory? The term underscores for me the experimental establishment of Botany Bay as part of a string of colonial port towns linked to the emerging shipping routes that created new southern geographies of power and influence. And it was in these remote colonial locales that I suggest experiments were possible in the formation of European society and the European self, from the understanding of oneself, understood in relation to non-European, racially marked others, and sometimes in opposition to them. Experiments in different colonial fields could be undertaken in radically different ways because of their distance from European social norms and oversight. The scholar Anne-Laura Stoller argues that colonies were not merely sites of exploitation or extraction of resources, but rather, she says, laboratories of modernity. Many traditions of knowledge that we may perceive to be distinctly European were not in fact endogenous, but emerged from the colonial encounter with colonial others. And relatedly, historians like Simon Schaefer argue for the critical role of non-European go-betweens in the construction of the modern world, especially in the domains of knowledge and science. So I argue, and this is my kind of provocation for today's talk as well, that the Australian colonies functioned both as a laboratory and as a site of scientific field work. And that was a distinction, the laboratory and the field, that emerged unevenly in Britain and Europe across the 19th century. From the Northern Hemisphere perspective, the colonial field was imagined by many as just a mere source of unique data. Yet, from the outset, colonists insisted on being involved in the process of making meaning from data, the alchemy of transforming data into knowledge. And the sometimes tense relations between colonial sites of collection and metropolitan sites of scientific theorization reveal intriguing histories of science. In the Antipodean laboratory, I suggest British imperial ideas were trialled in experimental sites that transformed and distilled those ideas before returning them to the Northern Hemisphere as textual artefacts and sometimes as material artefacts as well. Laboratories are social, historical, scientific, and cultural formations that create knowledge by defining what it is possible to know. Observing, collecting, and sorting data were collective practices that frequently involved vast geographical collaborations and multiple agencies, enabled by a kind of collective empiricism that was emerging in science in the 19th century and often required colonial governance and imperial networks. So the colonies provided innovative locations as science became increasingly global in scope and ambition during the 19th century. One really nice anecdotal example of this is that the Royal Society of Van Diemen's Land, established in 1843, was one of the first named royal societies outside Britain. But I also think that knowledge was shaped in really different ways in colonial locations, because the collection and analysis of data took place in innovative ways, in improvised spaces that shaped novel relationships between the inquirers. So the Rayettean voyager Tupaia joined Cook's first voyage after the ships left Tahiti. Tupaia's translation and cartographic skills are extremely useful to the famous navigator and the Endeavour crew in that sea of islands and the linguistic families that stretched from Polynesia to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Not so much in Australia, of course. Yet, Tupaia was suffering from scurvy by the time the Endeavour needed repairs on Cape York Peninsula on Gugu land. Tupaia slept on shore in a tent lent to him by Banks. And because Tupaia slept on shore, Gugu men approached him there and came to see that location as a space in which they could exchange meaningful linguistic information. It was the only meaningful linguistic collection that happened during the Endeavour's visit to the East Coast. Another tent in the 1820s and 30s, the Reverend Lancelot Threlkeld's tent near Lake Macquarie, which had been provided to him by Chief Justice Forbes for the purpose, enabled linguistic exchanges between Awabakal men and women and the Missionary that inaugurated not only that influenced world philology, but also changed how colonial courts dealt with Indigenous testimony. Informed by local First Nations people about their circumstances and assisted by the skilled Indigenous translator Birabin, Threlkeld also recorded shocking accounts of settler violence that circulated in court transcripts, poetry, and humanitarian magazines. For example, Threlkeld had a direct connection to the Aborigines Protection Society, and in 1839, their annual report described him as a witness of undoubted veracity and great experience, and they recirculated his highly controversial accounts of colonial violence and Indigenous suffering in New South Wales to their wide network of British readers through reports and journals. Settler naturalists made unique botanical observations in expeditions that were dependent on Indigenous guides and informed by Indigenous knowledge. George Cayley was sponsored by Banks to work as a natural history collector in Australia from 1800. Cayley wrote in detail to Banks in his letters about the difficulties of colonial collecting. To be frank, he whinged quite a bit, including how to deal with eucalyptus trees so tall that Europeans struggled to climb them, and parrots that dropped botanical specimens so randomly that their collections gathered from the ground were very imperfect. He became dependent on Daniel Mawatan, who you may well have heard of, from the Durrag clan of the Eora people, who'd been adopted as a boy by the constable and hangman, Richard Partridge, and his wife at Parramatta. Other Indigenous youth, Kadangera and Naring Jack, also assisted Cayley's collection of eucalyptus. In 1805, Mawatan accompanied Cayley on collecting voyages to Norfolk Island and Van Diemen's Land. By 1806, Mawatan was living with Cayley in Parramatta, and the two regularly travelled on collecting expeditions to the interior. Mawatan's skills were so important that Cayley proposed to Banks that all exploration voyages should employ Indigenous guides. He said many new birds would be readily obtained, as the natives in general are excellent marksmen and quicker sighted than our people. Cayley is now recognised as among the first Europeans to embrace Indigenous knowledge of the Australian fauna. And Got by Dan, as in Daniel Mawatan, occasionally marked the contributions of the Indigenous man in specimens that arrived in Banks's house in Soho Square. Now, the colonies also offered settler women new opportunities. Mary Johnson was even more frank than her chaplain husband, Richard, the first chaplain in Australia, about the challenges of their colonial posting when she wrote home from Port Jackson in 1795. She said, "I wish that I could tell you that the gospel flourished in this distant part of the world, but on the contrary, every sermon is treated with contempt. They neither regard the joys of heaven nor the torments of hell. It is all alike with them." Mary saw the Indigenous people she knew well, Burong and Bennelong, quite regularly, but noted that they seemed to prefer their own way of life. Later in the 19th century, educated women such as Eliza Hamilton Dunlop and Harriet Barlow found Indigenous women's company in domestic spaces and in the bush conducive to their own intellectual curiosity. These women, often on remote stations, collected edible plants and honey, accompanied by Indigenous women. They learnt to sew possum skin rugs, and they learnt about kinship, country, and the deep spiritual meanings of landscape, while caring for children across languages and cultures. They also heard about colonial violence and the disruption of Indigenous cultures in which they were complicit. In Dunlop's case, she broadcast that uncomfortable knowledge without prevarication in her 1838 publication, The Aboriginal Mother, a poem sympathetic to First Nations women and their suffering during the Myall Creek massacre. Now, governors' wives were perhaps less likely to hear such disruptive testimony firsthand, and were bound by their station not to undermine the settler colonial system that enabled their privileged position. But women used their own gendered networks of gentility, arts and sciences to influence their male family members' colonial careers and to further their own interests, as we've seen with Lady Jane Franklin. And Edmund Hobson's wife, the scientist with the drop of platypus blood, his wife Margaret illustrated some of his scientific journal articles. Because of his early and untimely death in Port Phillip, her contribution to knowledge by way of these fossil illustrations was unusual in being explicitly identified as her own work, even if the naming of the species, as you can see here, was claimed by the metropolitan expert, Richard Owen. By the mid to late 19th century, settler women were active botanical collectives. Recent studies have identified over 200 women collecting between 1853 and 1896 for Ferdinand von Mueller's ambitious planned Australian flora when he was the government botanist of Victoria. The opportunities available under settler conditions then were critical to white women's influence and intellectual and social mobility in colonial and imperial circles. So, collecting, distributing, and writing about distinctive forms of knowledge made available in the Australian colonies was collaborative work that brought together various forms of expertise. As we can see from the Diprotodon naming, authority and authorship, on the other hand, work to cement the heroic work of an individual. So the practice of scientific taxonomy is the prime example. Here we're looking at a bone, but previously I've been thinking about botanical specimens. And behind every holotype, herbarian holotype, the single specimen designated to be the name-bearing type of a species, sit the kind of bundles of objects and relationships that I've been describing to you today. So my book, The Antipodean Laboratory, analyses the distinctive fields of knowledge sourced from the Australian colonies in thick descriptions of these objects and relationships. So the botanical specimens collected by Banks and Daniel Solander, sketched and described by Sydney Parkinson, have been sifted through over 250 years to define the botanical knowledge that emerged from the Australian colonies. They were traded and circulated between individuals and institutions, even after they arrived in metropolitan collections. But they also originated in Indigenous worlds of use and trade before European collectors were even aware of their existence. So my book as a whole examines how distinctive knowledge about Indigenous cultures, convictism, and natural history from the Australian colonies influenced the development of modern fields of inquiry, such as humanitarianism, prison reform, and botanical science. Linguistic, literary, naturalist, and proto-anthropological networks worked together because the key protagonists knew each other and corresponded with each other. Warwick Anderson suggests that the small scale of intellectual life in colonial Australia provides a unique opportunity to reveal how local circumstances can prompt and shape intellectual work. The early Australian colonies, particularly New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, also provide a focused set of relationships through which to trace how key ideas about colonies were constructed. So these linked topics reveal how the Australian colonies enabled major social and cultural experiments under improvisational, intimate, and often violent frontier conditions. The Antipodean Laboratory thickens the traces of Indigenous and other traditional knowledge custodians to provide an analysis of the colonial archive that engages seriously with decolonisation as a reading practice. From the outset, Indigenous knowledge was present, but it was increasingly sidelined in the Northern Hemisphere and relegated to colonial situations. The messy complexity of knowledge collection as a collaborative process was largely confined to the colonies, as were the scandals and difficulties of settler and Indigenous cultures learning to live together in a new colonial landscape. In many cases, metropolitan scientific and philosophical inquiry sought to separate out the value of colonial data, its uniqueness, its innovation, from the troubling bundles of relationships in colonial situations. Generally, the further distant the data became from colonial situations, the more available it was to global theories and emerging disciplines. Colonial specimens were highly sought after in circuits of exchange, but colonial publications theorising about them were routinely ignored, including some of the articles in the Tasmanian Journal. But in these interlinked spheres of convictism, natural history, and humanitarian concerns about Indigenous welfare, the Australian colonies made a major contribution to modern global information systems because of their experiments in producing unique knowledge. The vast array of texts about the colonies mapped Australia in the world through the eyes of writers and readers eager to learn how morality, science, and society were cultured in the Antipodean laboratory, and how the Australian experience would influence the global development of modern ideas and societies. As my book explores across a range of intellectual areas, the agency still embedded within the material textual objects continues to offer us opportunities to better understand their historical resonances, their cultures of origin, and the ongoing and dynamic negotiation of meaning within contemporary Antipodean worlds, libraries, and laboratories. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's been wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Before the other people have questions, I'm always intrigued about von Mueller and the way that he engaged women across the Australian colonies to do that collecting for him. I think people have written about it, but it was one of those strange things that I wondered if you would comment more just briefly about that.
Yeah, look, I think von Mueller was very strategic and he had limited resources. And so I think that opened him to see women as a kind of an ultimate workforce to help him achieve his own ambitions. Botany is very interesting because it was seen to be an appropriate scientific activity for women in middle class and elite societies. The introduction of Linnaean naming kind of interrupted that a little bit because it talked a little bit too much about sexual parts in classification. So there was an earlier form. Joseph Banks' mother, for example, is well known to have had herbals and to have collected plants, and that seemed to be one of the inspirations for Banks's own interest in botany. But certainly in the Australian colonial locations, there's been a lot of excellent work which has traced the work of colonial collectors like von Mueller, and also women collectors, not just of botanical work, of course, although there are several famous examples of that, but also other forms of scientific inquiry. And there's I love that image of Margaret Hobson's Diprotodon bone, and there's a growing awareness globally actually of the role of women as fossil collectors and illustrators as well. So really interesting ways to think about where we locate the origin of knowledge and who participated in it.
Thank you. And Janelle's got her hand up.
Yeah, I can see. Janelle, I've unmuted you, so you're welcome to ask your question.
She's muted.
Okay.
I didn't intend to put my hand up, so I don't know how that happened. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I can see Warwick Anderson has his hand up. I'll allow him to talk now. And I'll just mute Janelle. Sorry, Janelle.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Now, I should apologise, first of all, because I missed a large part of your talk, Anna, inadvertently, that I just couldn't get out of an earlier meeting. And you may have addressed this, but I find your work very interesting. I just wonder, something I've come to think about more recently is the issue of hauntings, how objects are multiply haunted. And there's a lot of interest in anthropology, in hauntology, Derrida's notion of things and everything. Spectre is haunting Europe, going back to Marx and Engels. But I wonder whether you find that style of analysis useful in your own studies of these objects, whether you would actually find that analytically helpful in the sense of looking at Indigenous hauntings, but also the hauntings of these objects by other minor collectors, perhaps, rather than the elite white male analysts.
Thanks, Warwick, and lovely to have a question from you. I hope you managed to get in for the bit where I cited your work. So
I did. I was very impressed.
Excellent. You turned up for the footnote. Great.
Very pleased. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really it is an interesting way of thinking about it, the hauntings. I also like the idea that's coming out of quite a lot of people, Felix Driver and others, talking about the kind of the bundles of relationships that sit behind particular objects. And I think we could connect those ideas, objects and text as well. I mean, one of the reasons I started working in this way is that I had done a lot of work on Lancelot Threlkeld and his missionary work in Australia. And I'd always known that he published linguistic texts. I'm a literary historian. I'm not a linguist, and I used to find those texts just so unapproachable because of the very precise forms of reading that one, needs to be able to read linguistic texts. But at some point, I just told myself to pony up and to start reading them as a literary scholar. And what fascinates me about linguistic texts is that those are haunted by the colonial situations that produced them. And so whilst you can just read a word list and, you can note what kinds of words there were, there's very interesting history of philology and linguistic construction. When you start to think about the level of detail that most word lists go down to, they start with gross things, hands, heads, shoulders, but then they often go to like the gristle between the fingers or the joint between the little toe and the large toe. Like this kind of detailed observation could only have happened by two people sitting very closely to each other and touching either their bodies or the bodies of others. And that to me was a kind of breakthrough in thinking about how we can start to see through these texts, which in other ways often don't give us a sense of Indigenous agency or voice, but we can start to think about those colonial situations and start to recast them as well, not as kind of expert and informant, but as moments of knowledge sharing, because those Indigenous informants chose to share or not to share. And we know when we look at the different kinds of relationships that some kind of collectors gain some knowledge. We know about gendered protocols in Indigenous knowledge, for example. So we start to think about, what did it mean that most, kind of linguistic collectors were men? And I suppose that's why also my kind of, nice, embodied sort of feminist training is like, well, it wasn't just men who were collecting, it was women as well. And so what about women's word lists? What are the colonial situations in which women, settler women collected information? And what are the relationships between Indigenous women and settler women? And what were they doing when they were sharing language? And often those are things like collecting honey or collecting yams or water lilies or caring for children. So often women's words lists will include names for like child or your mother will be back soon. And I find these deeply evocative texts that help us to get to that kind of colonial situation, which I think is another way of talking about the hauntology. I love Derrida in my literary kind of theory classes, and I find those ideas about the archive and also about hauntology really theoretically provocative, but I also want to reconstruct and try to reread for that kind of material cultural production at the site of knowledge exchange as well.
If I may just briefly follow up, I don't know whether I'm still audible, but as you said all of that, I found that very, very interesting. But it also made me realise that, of course, it would be sensible for somebody to organised for your book to be reviewed with Emma Cavall's recent book, Haunted
Mm,
Biology. It would be a very nice conjunction, I think. I hope somebody
yeah.
does at some point. Yeah.
Maybe you could do that, Warwick. A
Maybe.
review essay by you, that'd be lovely. I'd be up for that. I'm
Well,
sure
yeah,
Emma would be too. Look, I
it's
think
very nice in theory.
I'm making bullets for your fire now. I think there is just a whole new body of work emerging, and this was mostly the unfootnoted version, except for you and a couple of other names. But when we think about the kind of work that Kate Fulliger's doing, for example, all the work that Tiffany Shellam's doing, Shino Konishi's work, Maria's work, the work on intermediaries, Lynette Russell's fantastic work on collecting and exchange. I feel like there's a kind of a major intellectual shift in how we look back at the colonial period and find new ways to account for that, which are much more inclusive and change the kind of national narrative in some really, well, maybe we can hope to change the national narrative in some really provocative and important ways.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Warwick. So just touching on that point about Indigenous intermediaries and their work in these word lists, we have a question on whether there's more scope for work on the early interactions and sharing of knowledge between Aboriginal people and, I guess, settlers. Is there more scope for that type of work, and would it be authored by First Nations authors? And that's in the Q&A there.
Yes, I mean the difficulty is that sorry, I'll just get the chat so I can see that context properly. Great, sorry, I'm just reading the questions there. Yes, the problem is, of course, that First Nations voices were often written out of the record, and I guess that was my point, is that when I was talking about how the further distant from the colonial site of collection, the more invisible Indigenous agency and knowledge becomes. That's in part because of scientific taxonomy and how it sort of names an individual European collector as the person who defines a species, for example. And so that's what I was trying to hint at in that idea about how European systems of knowledge, which were just emerging during that time, of course, like the word scientist wasn't coined until 1838. So one of the other really interesting things I think to remember is that all of this kind of work was happening in the Australian colonies. At the same time as Europe and Northern Hemisphere intellectual traditions were also kind of reforming and becoming more modern, becoming more what we know as scientific. So, and that's why I think the Australian colonies are so interesting, because they are a site where we can see non-European knowledges in Australia, First Nations knowledges, influencing how data was collected, what uses particular plants and animals, for example, were used for, and how that knowledge was transmitted or not transmitted back to the metropolitan centres, which sought to control scientific meaning making. So there are these kind of clusters of complicated relationships. Settlers really couldn't do much meaningful collection without Indigenous guides, particularly in the first 100 years. But imperial theorists and philosophers weren't particularly interested in that Indigenous settler connection. They were interested in making their name within emergent disciplines of knowledge, power, and influence. One of the really great examples comes from New Zealand, actually, where the missionary William Colenso insisted to William Hooker, the guardian of Kew Gardens, that Maori names for flax were maintained, and that he wanted to explain to Hooker that Maori people had told him, no, these can't be the same varieties because they're used for different purposes. And so Colenso, who worked really closely with Maori communities, tried to insist on the species being split up in ways that were consistent with what Maori users of those species of flax told him. But it took him many years to get to win that argument. But eventually, when Hooker produced that flora of New Zealand, it included Maori terms and Latin terms for a number of species. So there are ways to access that, even though it's not easy, and it often requires going to the journals and other accounts of the collectors to better understand how that information was collected and by whom.
Thank you. And we also have a question from Matthew, and this one's not in the Q&A. This is in the chat. Matthew would like you to elaborate on what hypotheses, or questions the colonial field or the colonial laboratory was supposed to solve.
Great. Yep. And I can see there a question about sort of mammoth fossil remains. So certainly Australian fossil remains were seen to be hugely influential on understanding geological time. Of course, as you'll have realised from my the way I describe the kinds of knowledge I'm interested in, religious ideas were also in ferment and foment at the time, right? And so Charles Darwin's work, Darwin, of course, came to Australia, and his Australian data was part of his formulation of major theories. But it also, Darwin's an interesting example where we see, kind of emergent discourses of religion and science, both being kind of challenged by the notion of the fossil remains within the Australian environment, as well as other kinds of environments. So certainly questions of geological time, but also about kind of religious time and the kind of the facticity of major religious texts were being tested. I also think one of the major things to consider is the notion of what became the scientific racism of European civilization and kind of superiority on a great ladder of being that became a truism by the late 19th century was really profoundly challenged in the Australian colonies in the late 18th and early 19th century. So I've thought a lot about that early period, in part provoked by Grace Karskens, who suggested that was a space I needed to think through with an earlier book. And because so much of the 18th century history of Australia is connected with the Pacific and with missionaries, for example, who were pushed out in 1796 of the Pacific Islands, there was a sense that those missionaries who were kind of advocates for morality had seen the Pacific as a space of disorder and terror, and then came to Australia. But they had a pretty awful time in the early Australian colonies as well, and they really called the morality of the penal, we've got a pre-penal at that stage, really called the morality of a kind of a state managed by soldiers into question, saw the early convicts amongst whom they lived as equally depraved, if not perhaps more depraved than the Polynesian pagans who they had just escaped from. And so some of those really foundational knowledges about racial superiority were really challenged in the first 20 to 30 years of the Australian colonies. So there's a variety of different hypotheses that the Australian colonies could be used to explore and perhaps to solve, Matthew. So yeah, great question.
Well, we've come to time, so I just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day today to present to the Royal Australian Historical Society, Professor Johnston. It's been much appreciated. And Christine, do you have any final words?
Well, really to say thank you so much. You've challenged us, which is great. I like that. And I wish you every success with the book. I think it'll be people will be discussing it at dinner parties for a long time to come. So thank you very much for today and taking the time to address us. Much appreciated.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Oh, Rosalie's got a hand up. One last. Yeah.
I think that might just be people
Yeah.
clapping,
Happy.
perhaps.
That's
Happy.
lovely.
Oh, well, yes,
I
indeed.
like the dinner party connection. You know, I like to think that Lady Jane Franklin might have used my book at her dinner party to
Oh, I think she
increase
would.
her influence. Thank you very
Yes,
much. Thank you to the
you.
audience, and
Thank
thank you
you.
for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.